This is episode number 18 of Foreign Object, and I'm your host, CJ Werleman. Last week we discussed film production with Hollywood producer Justin Canoe. It was a nice little break from all the madness currently taking place in the world. Today we return to the madness, but with someone who is actually working on combating said madness, specifically the madness of violent extremism. My guest is Dr. Anna Ali. She's an associate professor at Australia's Curtin University Department of Social Science and International Studies, and is the founding chair of People Against Violent Extremism. Last week, Anna spoke at the Combating Violent Extremism Summit in Washington, D.C., and after a grueling 36-hour flight from the east coast of the United States to the west coast of Australia, she is here with me now. Dr. Anna, welcome to Foreign Object.
Thanks so much, CJ.
How are you feeling?
I'm feeling exhausted, but happy to be home, I guess.
Yeah, that's as we're talking off air. It'll take you a few days to find your bearings again. But now tell me tell me everything I missed at last week's CVE summit.
Oh my gosh, you missed so much.
Did you meet President Obama?
No, I don't think anybody met President Obama. Look, I had a challenge from my friends to get a selfie with President Obama. Unfortunately, that didn't work out. The Secret Service were keeping him quite close to them, and it was really a matter of Obama coming in, giving his speeches, and then leaving. So we didn't get an opportunity to meet President Obama, but there was an opportunity to meet so many people from all around the world doing really, really great things at grassroots level, and I find that really inspiring, much more inspiring, I guess, than meeting somebody who is a politician or somebody who has a lot of power, because these are people who don't have a lot of power, who don't have a lot of resources at their hands, but are still managing to do really, really interesting, really innovative and really effective things on the ground to combat violent extremism.
So give me a gist or give my listeners a sense of your speech, what you spoke about.
Well, during the first day was all at the White House, and that was all civil society. So that day was a range of panels, mostly focused on the homeland situation in the US. So we had presentations from Minnesota, LA, and Boston of good news stories of programs that were being run there to combat violent extremism with communities throughout the US. And then there were some panels, and I attended the panel on youth, which had examples from Northern Ireland, an example of this really inspiring young man who grew up getting involved in gang violence, and he was in and out of juvenile detention, and now he really works with young people to keep them out of gangs. So that was the first day. The second day was held at Department of State, and the second day was when we had representatives from different governments and different countries, so over 80 different countries. And each representative got up on a panel, and they only had 6 minutes to speak. So you can imagine giving politicians and ministers a challenge of speaking for 6 minutes. Let me tell you, there were a lot of people who did not stick to time. And very expected, of course. And so on that day, that's the day that I spoke, not as a minister or a head of any delegation, but as somebody who then would interject. So what you would have the ministers or heads of delegation giving their 6 minute spiel, and then you had the opportunity, like there were people in the audience who were then given a role, and I was one of those people, and we were given a role to interject or come back at them with something. So my role was to come back at them with the about the subject of engaging communities that may be hostile towards governments.
Right. And so what was the event? Was the event exclusively focused on terrorist acts committed by Muslims, or did it include all variety of political terrorism?
Look, absolutely not. Like, I was reading a lot of the controversy in the lead up to the CVE summit, and particularly from American Muslim groups saying this is going to solely and exclusively focus on Muslims, and it's going to further stigmatise Muslims. And it really didn't. Like, there were examples from Northern Ireland. There were examples of gang violence with youths. And more importantly, there were examples of Muslims doing work in this area. And I think that's really necessary, and I think that's really important that we look at the work that young Muslims in particular are doing in places like Somalia, and the young Muslim Somalians in Boston who were doing a lot of work, in Minnesota, who were doing a lot of work in this area too. So, I really take an issue with those who were skeptical, or I suppose it's okay to be skeptical, but who are continuing to be negative about the summit because they were saying it was exclusively focused on Muslims. I can tell you it wasn't. And I think
that's great.
I think if you speak to people there, they'll tell you it wasn't. And Obama's speech was very measured in that regard as well. He was very clear to say that, this is an issue, but it's not. Let's not make it the only issue. That terrorism has no religion. So he's very clear in that message.
Well, I guess a lot of the problem that a lot of my colleagues had was the fact that you've got President Obama speaking on, he spoke on free speech and equality, and said how these things are counterweights to extremism. But on the one hand, sitting in the audience, you had Israel and Egypt and Saudi Arabia applauding in the audience, and these are countries, our allies, our states, which deny free speech and equal rights to their citizens. I think it was the hypocrisy, which upset a lot of liberal-minded judges of what was happening at the summit. Do you think that's fair criticism?
Oh, I think that's very fair criticism, and I think it was very fair criticism to talk about also with the Paris attacks, how you had these countries also, walking in line and marching for free speech at the Paris attacks, and then flogging people at home for their journalistic freedom. So yes, I completely agree with that, and I think there is a certain level of hypocrisy there as well. But that's not. I think that's a hypocrisy that comes back onto those Arab leaders. To President Sisi, for example, who, stands up for free speech, yet imprisoned an Australian journalist and still has imprisoned 2 other Al Jazeera journalists.
Well, and mass imprisoned hundreds, if not thousands, of Muslim protesters and mass executed. In a number of cases, and that's a regime that we propping up. This is where the hypocrisy really stinks. It's you had the Charlie Hebdo attacks in Paris, and Je suis Charlie, and everybody promoting free speech, and France, champion of equality, liberty, family, and then on the next 2 weeks after that attack, they're selling $7 billion worth of weaponry to the Sisi regime in Egypt. That's where I guess upset me was is there really an honest debate on combating violence extremism taking place when these regimes, these Arab tyrants, are really the powder kegs for radicalizing people in their populations.
Yeah, CJ, there's a real issue here. The thing with violent extremism is that it is so complex and so broad that I think it needs to be cut up into chunks for us to deal with. Because I think that what often happens is that it becomes an issue that is so entangled with other issues that if you were to try and separate them, or if you were to only deal with it as one big broad issue, you do get caught up in all of these things, like the hypocrisy of free speech, like the hypocrisy of Arab world leaders, and for example, the hypocrisy as well that a lot of people were critical of having Israel there, and the fact that the White House was hosting a summit when the White House fully supported Israel's actions in Gaza last year.
Sold them weapons during their siege of Gaza. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. But I think, that what I got out of this, and the positive that I got out of this, was really that grassroots stuff, because I work at that level. I work at that grassroots level where you're really not doing it independent of government, because if you were to work with government, you would be caught up in all of that bureaucracy. You would be caught up in all of that hypocrisy as well. Talk about freedom of speech. You don't even have to go all the way to Egypt. You can just come here to Australia, where our government is after the Paris attacks, was talking about freedom of speech, and then 2 days ago announced that it wants to ban Hizb ut-Tahrir. Who have not committed any crime, who have not crossed any line. Yeah, I don't like what they say. In fact, I abhor what they say in terms of their opposition to democracy. But they haven't crossed any legal barriers. They're not outwardly and openly promoting violence. So, again, another example of hypocrisy, albeit a very different example to the one that we were just talking about. But if you were to get caught up in all of that, it'd be really, really hard to look at the positives of people doing work on the ground.
Well, this is exactly why I wanted to speak to you, because as a journalist, it's easy for me to sit in a helicopter and fling shit, in different directions. But I want to speak to you because you're somebody who's actually working at the grassroots level to actually doing something about combating terrorism. There's plenty of opinion writers, and the world has full of bloggers and so forth that have want to thrust their own agenda into the body politic. But so that's what I want to get a sense of what is actually happening. And now you founded Pave, People Against Violent Extremism. So tell me a little bit about what Pave is all about.
Well, Pave was we started in 2013, and it was I really set up Pave because I recognised that there was this huge gap between the research, like the kind of research that I was doing, but the kind of research that I was reading about, the policy, because I've worked in government before, and I know that government often will develop policy in isolation, and in its, with people with government minds really don't have the same kinds of understanding of issues as people who work on the ground. And practice. So there was this big disjoint between the three, and I thought, no, I've got to have a way of getting research translated into practice so that it can influence policy. And really the best way to do that was to set up an NGO. So I started Pave in 2013 and started off, the first thing that we've done is really, when we looked at what it is that needs to be done in this area, we really need to raise awareness of violent extremism. And we need to raise awareness of violent extremism as a social issue and as a civil society issue. And let me tell you, that's been more and more increasingly difficult here in Australia because, unfortunately, every time our good Prime Minister opens his mouth, that sets me back 10 years. Because unfortunately, the discourse here around violent extremism is that it is a national security issue, it's a public safety issue, and so we've been trying to change that language and change that discourse and raise awareness of it as a social issue in order to get more civil society participation in countering violent extremism. So the first thing we've done is we've got to have a social media presence, and we've got to counter the narrative of violent extremism online. So we got some money from the federal government. Mm-hmm. From the previous federal government through their building community resilience grants program to do a fully online social marketing exercise, which involves films, posters. We have podcasts. We work with former violent extremists. We have podcasts by them to get out messages that counter the messages of groups like Islamic State, but also we work very much in that extreme right-wing area as well. So we're non-sectarian and we're apolitical. So we look at violent extremism across the board, not really based on any particular ideology, but really around the violence of extremism across the board.
And what percentage, what chunk of it is, would you say, is focused on the Islamic piece?
We probably do 50-50 because, okay. I mean, if you look at our films, one thing that we were very conscious of, in our films we use two faces. We have a blonde, blue-eyed kid. Mm-hmm. Is one of our talents. So we have two talents. One is a blonde, blue-eyed kid, and the other one is actually my son, who is dark, Middle Eastern looking. Yep. And in all of our media, they mirror each other in everything that they do. And the whole idea, I mean, the tagline for our posters is violent extremism has many faces. Don't make yours one. Uh-huh. And the purpose, I like it too.
I like it.
You like it? I made that one up, huh?
There you go. That's good. A big gold star for that one.
So in all our media, in our films, in our posters, they mirror each other, and that's really there was two reasons for that. One reason was very much to raise awareness of the fact that violent extremism isn't just an Islamic thing, mm-hmm. And you can't profile it based on any kind of ethnicity or any look or anything like that. But the second reason for that was also because so much of the focus on violent extremism is on Muslims, on the Arab and Muslim-looking type of youth, that kind of that profile of what it looks like, and that has actually caused a lot of. I guess it's been counterproductive, so to say, because people then resist that. There's been a counter movement against that. So it was really to balance that out as well, and to really bring the focus on the violence of extremism. Once again.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, and what pushback? I mean, for the most of my listeners are Americans. Obviously, I'm Australian, but I haven't lived there for more than a dozen years. But for the benefit of my listeners, the current Australian Prime Minister is uber conservative, probably the most conservative Prime Minister Australia's had in its history. John Oliver from The Daily Show did a piece on him. I don't know if you saw this, where he did it, Tony Dum Dum.
I'm going to see it now.
Oh, yeah, so it is hilarious. It's hilarious. You got the final clip in there, this montage is this 70-year-old senior citizen walking towards Tony Abbott walking towards him in a supermarket, and Tony Abbott goes to shake his hand because he's on the campaign trail, and this guy looks at Tony Abbott and goes, "Fuck off, dickhead."
That was real too, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was real.
Good on him.
Now, is he really? How hard is he jumping or seizing the opportunity in inverted commas to implement draconian national security measures in Australia on the back of the Sydney siege? And I'll preface that question with the fact that you came under some political fire from I'm not sure if it was Abbott, but it was some backbenchers, because you had suggested it was all too suspicious or convenient that that mass arrest, or that raid involving 800 police and the arrest of 25 individuals sort of came at the same time that they were wanting to legislate that piece on Homeland Security. So, yes, speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, that was really funny, because I was on a show, and the Minister for Justice was on that show, and he wouldn't even admit that it was slightly uncanny. I'm like, you don't think it's slightly uncanny? The timing is slightly uncanny? He says, no. I mean, just a little bit uncanny? No. Even just a tiny, tiny, tiny bit uncanny? No. So,
Wouldn't it throw your bone?
Wouldn't give an inch, man. So I came under fire for suggesting that. Look, and I'm not one to exaggerate threat, and I'm also not one to buy into, I guess, conspiracy theories, if you like. But it is really, really bad here. It's really bad. So in July last year, the government ceased any kind of soft programs. By that I mean any kind of community-based programs to counter violent extremism that were set up by the previous government. And they said, we're stopping this and we're going to overhaul the whole thing and develop something completely new. And that was in July last year. And then in September last year, they announced that they were putting $640 million towards counterterrorism, and $13.4 million of that was going to go towards countering violent extremism. Again, these community-based soft-type programs. Since then, they've introduced a raft of legislative measures. So taking away of passports, stopping people from travelling, declaring some places no-go zones. So if you go there and you come back to Australia, you have to prove that you were there for a legitimate purpose, or else you get arrested. Huge raids across the nation. All of these really hard legislative measures. And in the meantime, no soft programs. Nothing has eventuated on the soft side. So what we have now is we have a real imbalance of the hard and the soft. And, it's very well known in this area that the most effective way is to balance hard and soft. You balance the hard stuff with programs that are designed to engage people, that are designed to work with communities and individuals, so that you have a more effective counterterrorism approach. But what's happened in Australia is, over the past few months, because these soft programs have completely ceased, but we've had more and more introduction of these hard programs. So I can honestly, hand on heart, say that it's the worst I've seen it for at least a decade, since at least 9/11. Because what we have now is Muslim communities feeling extremely scrutinised, the relationship has been extremely securitized, which interestingly was something that President Obama warned against in his speech. And I didn't get a look at our Attorney General's face, well, because he was in the audience, but I would have loved to have seen his face when Obama said that. And they're much, much less willing and much more hostile, again, willing to work with and much more hostile towards the government and any kind of government programs. So now going in there and trying to do any work with Muslim communities is so much more difficult because of how the government has framed this as solely a security issue to be dealt with only by law enforcement, only by the police forces. And when they started stopping, taking away passports and stopping people from travelling, I warned them and I said, you've got a young kid who has put in his mind that he's going to go overseas to fight. So he's on a pathway to violence. You take away that pathway, okay, but you don't give him any other option. What he's going to do, you don't give him any way of changing that pathway from violence to something else. He's going to continue on that pathway to violence, but he's going to find an opportunity to commit that violence right here in Australia. So you're actually creating more opportunities for people to commit acts of violence here at home by taking away their passports and then not filling that gap with some kind of program that diverts them away from violence.
Yeah, I mean, you're making so much, you're so perfectly, it seems so common sense when you frame it. I mean, why is it that 14 years after 9/11, our governments still don't seem to be capable of learning anything about combating extremism? They're doing exactly what the extremist groups want governments to do, and that's to segregate and alienate and, oppress with these heavy-handed tactics, with these police tactics, with community infiltration rather than community outreach. Why aren't we learning? Why we keep repeating the same mistakes?
Look, I wish I had an answer to that, but the only answer I can offer up is politics. I don't know if you know, or if your listeners know what's been happening in Australian politics lately. But last week, I think it was, or the week before, there was a leadership spill, and the leadership of our Prime Minister was threatened by some backbenchers and some people in his party. And in 2007, the John Howard's government rode to victory here in Australia on a wave of fear. A wave of fear of terrorism in 2001, right after the September 11 attacks in the United States. And I think that Tony Abbott now is trying to recreate that and replicate that. As soon as governments, or as soon as politicians find themselves in a situation where their leadership is threatened, fear becomes the most powerful frame to win back their leadership, because a nation in fear doesn't want change. They don't want change, because change is something that unsettles that fear. And I think he's trying to recreate his predecessors' success on fear of terrorism. And I think some people in the public have seen that. But a lot of people in Australia are not really politically engaged. And so they're the kind of people who are not likely to see that and who are likely to buy into that fear and buy into that rhetoric of fear as well. So it's a really, really sad situation, I have to say. It's really quite depressing here, because you have governments that are pulling us back 10 years, and meanwhile at the grassroots level you have a shitload of innovation happening in this area. You have young people coming up with these brilliant ideas. You have things happening like hackathons and new apps and like really, really innovative stuff. And then you go to these things and you hear these young people speaking and you get really inspired, and then you walk into the next room where you have a politician talking in monotone, and then you just get all deflated again.
Yeah, that's. I mean, I'm getting frustrated listening to you.
Wasn't my intention.
I've noticed, as I said, I haven't lived in Australia for 12 years, but one of the change in climate that I noticed in Australia was how nationalistic Australia suddenly became. And I don't know where it was, I can't put a year on it. Maybe it was around that post 9/11, early post 9/11 period. But I remember as a kid growing up that Australia Day was just a day off. It was no big deal. Now, every time I go back to Australia, and it happens to be Australia Day when I am in Australia visiting, it's become so uber nationalistic and jingoistic, and Australian flags everywhere. Not that there's anything wrong with a flag, but come on, you don't put them on your fucking face.
I know. Or on your kids' face. They're all over your kids' bodies. Yeah.
Oh God. So is the climate right for Abbott, a conservative prime minister, to play on that kind of nationalism? Is that what's happening down there?
Do you know what? I think it is and it isn't. I think, after 9/11 things were pretty bad. But then I think the decade after that things got quite a bit better. I thought things got quite a bit better. And I'm not sure whether that's because, that's when I got my PhD and started working, and maybe, you start associating with and seeing a different side of things. I don't know whether that's like my change in my environment or it actually was better. So I have to kind of throw that in there. But I certainly did feel that things got better. Like, our newspapers and our magazines there were a lot more good stories about Muslims on the news. I mean, there was still a lot of bias there, but I felt that it was getting better. And I think that the Sydney siege and the response from civil society with the hashtag I'll ride with you, I thought was really, really good. And I think that showed...
It was fantastic.
It was just a real example of exactly what I work towards, is that this kind of, if this is what violent extremism wants to do, fight it, resist it, combat it at that level. Don't rely on our politicians, because they're not going to do that for us, man. The government can talk all it likes, but its commitment to countering violent extremism is demonstrated in its actions, not in its words.
But that hashtag, actively that hashtag I'll ride with you, obviously made news all the way around the world. But for every hashtag, then you've got there's a columnist in Australia called Miranda Devine. She's Australia's Ann Coulter, and I remember she wrote a piece was just horribly shadowed over that hashtag, and it was mean-spirited, it was racist, it was demonic, it was, and then I start to think, well, is the fact that hashtag has made a headline, what's percolating underneath that?
Yeah. I've got a story about her, actually, because a couple of months before that, when I went on Q&A, which is a national current affairs show, I guess, and I got all that backlash about saying, in particular, I said something about terrorism and counter-terrorism being theatre, and a lot of people didn't like that because they didn't understand it. Now, I would love to say that I made up that term, but I didn't. I actually stole it from Brian Jenkins, who coined that term back in the 1970s. So she wrote a piece about me in the Australian, which is a conservative rag that she writes for. Not that she writes very well, but she wrote a piece about me, basically discrediting me completely. Like, who is this woman? What makes her an expert on counterterrorism? They should have got a bloke from Defence to speak on counterterrorism. And I thought, right, okay, she doesn't even know me. But that day, on the day of the Sydney siege, I happened to be in Sydney, and I got asked to do the Today program on Channel 9. And as I was leaving, they said, "Oh, you're not to leave. You're going to do something with Miranda Devine." And I went off at them. Like, I'd been up since 4 a.m. I'd had 2 hours sleep because I was covering the siege. And so I just went off. I was, I'm not getting on stage with that fucking bitch. I was going off, and she walked past as I said that, and I looked at her, I said, yeah, you're a fucking bitch, you're a liar. I was really going off, and my husband's like, settle down, babe, settle down. Don't act like a diva because they won't have you on again. I'm like, I don't give a fuck if they don't have me on again.
Oh, man, that's awesome. I wish next time you're back in the US, I want you to single out Ann Coulter and find her and do the same thing.
So then I get up on stage. So I was about to leave, like I was chucking a tanty, like nothing else. And I have to say to your listeners, I'm not normally like that. I'm really actually very sweet and delightful. But yeah, that was a bad day.
I'm actually going to have to give a glossary at the end of this interview because we've used so many Australian slang terms that I haven't heard in 2 years. From a rag is a newspaper and a tanty is a tanty. There you go.
Oh, yeah, that's true. Americans wouldn't use tanty.
Nor rag.
Right. Oh, okay. So then I got called by the producer. Please come back. We promise. I said, okay, I've got 3 conditions. I don't sit next to her, because if I sit next to her and she says something, I can't guarantee what I'm going to do. I said, secondly, I want breakfast. I want breakfast for me and my husband, because we've been here since 4 a.m. And I said, and thirdly, if you put me up there and parade me as the token Muslim, I will walk off your stage. I am an associate professor, and you will mention my title at least 3 times during that whole interview.
That's awesome. You did go deeper.
Yeah, I did. So they were like, yeah, that's fine. I didn't ask for them to give me some M&Ms with all the green ones taken out, but I could have.
No, that's brilliant. No, so I just want to bring it back to radicalisation a little bit, and also what's happening in Australia. How many Australians now are there fighting in Syria and Iraq? What's the estimate?
Yeah, the estimate's around 180, but it's really hard to really clarify those estimates. So it's around 180 at the moment, which is pretty high.
Is there a typical radicalisation pathway that these guys are following? Is something in particular that's radical? What do we know about radicalisation as it comes to the 180 Australians that are over there?
Do you know what, CJ? The more we think we know, the actual less that we know. Because, we used to think that, okay, radicalisation was this kind of process, although not linear, but that, you look at radicalisation models out there and they all pretty much have certain stages to them. And the first stage is more about seeking, so the individual becomes interested in something, and then they become really, curious about it, then they become engaged by it, they become attracted by it, they become persuaded by it, to the point where then they decide that, this is such a cause, this is a cause that I really want to, that I think I can only fight with violence. But that's all changed. And, lately I hear a lot of people talking about how radicalisation is so rapid these days, that people become radicalised in 2 to 3 weeks. And I've got a bit of an issue with that, because I really don't think that somebody can become radicalised in 2 to 3 weeks. What we understand about radicalisation is that it is a complete overhaul of one's worldview. So you have normally pretty unextraordinary people, pretty normal people, pretty average people, who may not have committed any crime in their life, who may have, just your average Joe Blow. There's another Australian thing, I think.
That's going in the glossary.
Your average kind of guy who over a period of time changes his or her entire worldview, and that's psychologically that's really hard to do over a number of weeks. There's also been a lot of talk about radicalisation being completely online, as if somehow somebody watches something online and goes, "Yep, that's it. I'm going to go and fight. I'm completely radicalised now." Well, I think that's a bit of bullshit there. I don't think that's possible at all. And, there needs to be more research done into that. There's a whole lot of assumptions that we have about radicalisation there as well. So I think now when we talk about radicalisation, we really need to start recognising that for some people, the cause to commit violence or the trigger to commit violence isn't necessarily radicalisation at all, but that it is an escalation of some already violent tendencies. Now, let me.
Oh, that's interesting. I haven't heard it framed that way. That's interesting. Go on.
So, and it's not for everyone, but it's for some people. Yeah. Now, let's take the example of Man Monis, the Sydney siege guy. Mm-hmm. He had a history of violence. Mm-hmm. He had been in court charged with a violent attack against his ex-wife, murder of his ex-wife, in fact. So he had a history of violence. The same with the guys in Paris, the same with the guy in Canada. They all had a history of violence. So I'm starting to think...
Also a history of violence perpetrated onto them.
Exactly.
Yep.
Exactly. So they come from a particular criminal past, if you like, as well. So I'm starting to think, right, and all of them, there's this idea that they all were rapidly radicalised. Yeah, it was just a matter of weeks and they became radicalised through the internet. Well, I'm starting to think, well, maybe that, and I know, I'd like to do some more research into this. So at the moment, this is just a theory that I've got. Mm-hmm. But I'm thinking, okay, well, in these cases where you've got this so-called rapid radicalisation of people who already had a preclusion to violence, perhaps then this is more of an escalation of violence. And so they see a way now of committing an act of violence that's framed in a cause, that they can frame that they can justify with a cause. So it's not so much that they've changed their complete outlook on life, or that we can call them radicalised in the way that we would traditionally call somebody radicalised. They haven't had a complete change in their worldview. They haven't completely bought the whole ideology. They haven't completely drunk the Kool-Aid, so to speak. But they've seen a way of using this to further their acts of violence. It's just an escalation of their violence. And then on the other side, you've got those ones who do go through that process, who have completely changed their worldview, who have completely shown signs and visible signs of becoming a totally different person psychologically, socially, ideologically, and who have bought the whole package, who have drunk the Kool-Aid. And I think these are two different kinds of cases, two different kinds of radicalisation, and I'm not even sure that you can call the first one radicalisation at all. I think you could call it escalation of violence, but I'm not even sure that you could call that radicalisation.
No, I really like that term, escalation of violence. Are you familiar with Arun Kundandi's work? He's an NYU professor?
No, I'm not. Tell me about it.
Okay, he wrote the book The Muslims Are Coming, Islamophobia and the War on Terror. And he basically he looked at all the policing models of radicalisation, sorry, all the models of radicalisation at different counter-terrorism police forces we're using around the world. Everyone from the NYPD to the LAPD, and then in London, and and basically you can find any number of terrorists who or extremists who fall outside of those models. There's it really isn't a one size fits all. And whether it's the bunch of guys theory, or it's the prison theory as well.
Yeah, look, I'd agree with that, and I've written a paper looking at the Silver and Bart model, which is the NYPD model, where they basically say anybody who's Muslim is at the pre-radicalisation phase. So basically, just by virtue of being Muslim, you're primed and ready to become an extremist, to carry out an act of violence.
We've got 1.6 billion terrorists ready to go then.
Ready to go, standing there, guns
waiting
ready.
For the order.
Or this idea that, these young Muslims are sitting there watching the internet with their mouths agape, just ready to be radicalised. I would say, I've been thinking about this a lot lately, I would say that out of all of the young kids, I meet a lot of young Muslim kids because I work in that area here, and I would say that pretty much 99% of them have come in contact with some kind of stuff online. And you don't even have to go online to look at what the ISIS propaganda. You just got to turn on your television and you can see, your 6 o'clock news is broadcasting the latest message from ISIS or ISIL or Daesh or whatever you want to call them. So 99% of people, unless you're living under a rock, know what this organisation is all about. Yeah.
And
99. Sorry.
I was going to say, what's interesting is that, you're talking about 99%, it seems to be 99% of all arrests that the FBI have made in intercepting a pending terrorist attack. It was the FBI informants who actually radicalised the youth. They target a Muslim who has social problems, drug problems, criminal problems, and they infiltrate these communities. They juice them up to buy weapons and then seize on them. But the radicalisation wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for the FBI informer who did the radicalising. It's
exactly, and I want to pick up on what you say there about they're finding youth that are disenfranchised, that are in trouble, and using that vulnerability, because it's the same situation here. So you have 99% of young Muslims are coming into contact in some form or other with this ISIS propaganda, just like 99% of the general population, because it's really hard to avoid it. But out of that 99%, 99.99 of them walk away from it. They don't engage in it, right? And it's that very, very small percentage, and most of them, usually, not all of them, most of them have also come in contact with a person in their everyday life, whether it be a violent extremist preacher or, as you say in the case of the example that you just gave, somebody who's out there to radicalise them in order to catch them, Yeah,
Yep.
and they're being sucked in that way. So this whole idea of the internet is the one that radicalizes young Muslims, and that they're all standing there with their mouths agape, just waiting to be radicalized. And this idea of vulnerability really needs to be looked at more closely, because from what I'm seeing, it's actually the fact that a lot of Muslims are resilient to this propaganda, not vulnerable to it.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you look at the total, numbers. You just break down the math. You know, it's 1.6 billion Muslims, and ISIS is 20,000 strong by some estimates, and then Al Qaeda is about in the Arabian Peninsula is about 5,000, and then Boko Haram is about 20,000. So right there, in the three biggest terrorists, or the three biggest Islamic extremist terrorist groups, you know, we're at 0.0000001%. So
Exactly. And people talk a lot about, oh, you know, we have to counter the propaganda of ISIS. They've got this huge media presence. Yeah, they've got a huge media presence. They're online, and they use a number of different social platforms and whatever. But as I said, they have to cast their net very far and very wide to catch a very small percentage of converts, of people converting to their ideology. Now, if they were a business, that'd be rendered pretty ineffective for the amount of resources that they put into their media presence. The number of people who are consuming and converting to their product, if you like, is actually very, very small percentage of that. In a business terms, they're not doing very well. But we seem to think that they're doing so well online, and that their propaganda is really selling and it's really attractive. I think we need to start questioning those assumptions.
Yeah, Max Abrams, he's a journalist here in the US, and he focuses particularly on terrorism, and he wrote a piece, I think it was today or yesterday, on how the ISIS's online presence has been, wildly exaggerated.
Oh, it is. It is grossly exaggerated. And what's interesting is that we are now making arrests based on that, based on these assumptions that people are watching stuff online, and then that now they have a desire to commit an act. You know, we're turning into that, that movie Minority Report,
Yeah.
where people are arrested on pre-crime. It's almost at that level, where people are arrested and detained because they've watched a video. And so there's this assumption that they're watching this video, or they're retweeting something, and we all know how benign an act retweeting is,
Yeah.
or watching or looking at or reposting something on Facebook, and that is assumed to be an indication that they're going to commit some kind of violent act.
Well, it's an assault on democracy, because it then imposes self-censorship on people, and particularly minority groups. They self-censor, and then, and where minority groups don't feel like they can enter into the political debate, they feel even more alienated, more segregated, and therefore, they feel like, it increases the likelihood that they'll lash out. So.
Oh, exactly, and this is the issue that we're having now, because you've got people who just, like, there are people who won't even say the word terrorism, Muslims who won't even say the word terrorism, because they're scared that they're going to get arrested just by saying the word, So then you've got young people who, I know, it is really sad, and I'm not exaggerating, that's actually true. Like, I've heard people say it under their breath and then look around because they're scared that somebody's listening to them and they're going to be arrested. So, and then you've got young people who want to talk about this shit, they want to talk about what's going on in Syria and Iraq, but nobody will talk to them about it because everyone's shit scared that if you talk about it based on chatter, you're going to get arrested. So then you're leaving these young people up to to get informed through the people who are willing to talk to them about it, which are the violent extremist preachers. They're the ones who are out there talking about it, because and the moderates and their parents and everyone else is going, shh, 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 don't talk about it. Yeah. So you're creating a situation in which you're forcing young people to get their information from the wrong sources.
Yeah, absolutely, and we've gone way over time, and I'm exhausted listening to you. You've given me you've thrown so much information out there, and I'd also forgotten how quick Australians speak.
Oh, really? Yeah, I know. I practiced that too. But you know what they say? Give the girl a microphone; she never shuts up.
No, it's great. I'm going to be listening to this again tonight. I mean, you've so much good information you've given out there, and you've raised so many things which aren't being discussed in the debate. The terrorism debate here in the United States is so banal, it's so ridiculous. The main debate is here of what to call ISIS, or how to define the enemy. The enemy is ISIS. Defined it. Because
doesn't matter what you call them.
Yeah, it's just this political hot potato. Because the bigots, and the conservatives just want to say Muslims. They just want to call it Islam. They just want to hear you say it. But you're working at the grassroots level. You're actually doing something to combat extremism. It is a problem. I don't think it's going to go away anytime soon, because there doesn't seem to be any honest debate on how to target the resentments on which the terrorists thrive. And when we spoke about that earlier, in propping up these regimes like Egypt and Israel and Saudi Arabia, and until we deal with these tyrants in the Middle East that oppress Muslims with our support, then those resentments are never going to go away, and we're going to be faced with a perpetual problem. But so how can my listeners find you? What's the easiest place to find you? Your website, your Twitter?
Yeah, best way, I'm on Twitter. It's Azza, A-N-N-E, Azza, A-Z-Z-A, Ali, all one word. So, yeah, please do tweet me. Or follow us on Pave, People Against VE, on Twitter. We're on Facebook, and our website is pave.net.au.
Fantastic. Awesome, Anne. That's been great having you on. I'm glad I finally got to speak to you.
Yeah, me too, CJ. It's great. Thanks so much.
No problem. All right, now get some rest after your grueling flight. Have a beer and have a lie down.
I'll go put a shrimp on the barbie for you.
There you go. Good on you, Anne. I'll talk to you soon.
Okay, thanks, CJ. Have a good one.
You too. Bye-bye.
Cheers.